Welcome to this episode of OtherNetwork Conversations. I am Federico Martelli and I am part of the OtherNetwork team. We are very sorry that this episode comes so delayed, but we have been super busy organizing the year ahead for the OtherNetwork platform. We are planning a series of texts that we will publish in the platform soon. We are organizing a couple of exhibitions, one in Johannesburg and the other one in Sao Paulo, hopefully also this year. We are also organizing a series of local events with the researchers that are located in different cities around the world. And also we are organizing, of course, the next episodes of this podcast. So we have been super busy in these months trying to get together all the planning for the months ahead. OtherNetwork is a project created to emphasize the importance of independent art spaces around the world. And the point of this podcast is to look behind the scenes at what it means to run a project space and trying to pick apart the definition of independence in different contexts. These project spaces, they operate normally under very different conditions, but at the same time, they share very common challenges and some of the same successes. So for us, it's kind of interesting to speak to many of these project spaces, how they survive, how they program their spaces, and how they deal with the different challenges that are, some of them are super specific to the local situation. We recorded this special episode in Accra in November 2023, where OtherNetwork facilitated an exhibition at the Foundation for Contemporary Art, Ghana. OtherNetwork's series of exhibitions take the form of a relay. So one artist-led project space invites another project space from anywhere in the world to guest curate a program in their own space. So for this iteration, FCA Ghana invited Nothing Gets Organized from Johannesburg. We took the opportunity to record this episode the day after the opening of the exhibition while everyone was together in one place. In this conversation, Ato Annan and Sinethemba Twalo sat down with Colin Keys from OtherNetwork to talk about the nature of this collaboration. Please be aware that given the nature of recording the episode on site, you may hear some background noise from the market outside of the venue. I hope you will enjoy it.
Today we're recording a very special episode from the library and exhibition space of the Foundation for Contemporary Art Ghana. It's a hot day outside, but there's a gentle breeze under the canopy of enormous trees that have shaded the site, and we discovered that there's a craft market set up this morning. So there's been a lot of activity here this week surrounding the opening of the exhibition Delay and Encounter and or Other Proximate Unknowns, guest curated by NGO Nothing Gets Organised. We'll come back to that later when it's time to bring in our guest, but until then I'm sitting down with Ato Annan, who's one of the co-directors of FCA Ghana. So thanks for hosting us today, Ato.
Hello.
So Ato, could you start by describing the space we're sitting in right now? Where are we?
Yes, we are currently in the FCA library. It's gone through many transformations over the years, exactly 19 years. When we first were given this space, it used to be one of the quarters of the main buildings, and we had to renovate it and then use it as a library space and also a project space. And so we have our shelves, our books, now our archives from the many years of being in this space and the various projects that we have done.
Okay, how long have you been in this space itself for?
19
years.
Yeah, I mean, right from when FCA was founded, we came into the Bois Center and asked for a place. In exchange for that, they asked us to help to be more or less their curatorial advisors for the museum.
Okay, so you've always had a long-standing relationship with the Du Bois Museum, so you share a site, but you also work with them significantly?
Yeah, it's kind of changed over the years, but that's how it began. But we've always had some kind of relationship with them.
Okay, so maybe let's go back a bit to how you actually got involved and sort of took over the reins as the directors of FCA.
So I met two artists who were members of the FCA at another meeting. And it was Akirash, a Nigerian artist living in Ghana at that time and working from here. Victor Masok, a Cameroonian artist living in Ghana and working from here at that time. They invited me to a project we're doing at the Accra Psychiatric Hospital with their patients. So they will go in twice a week or thrice a week and do some kind of occupational therapy or art therapy with their patients. So they invited me along to kind of be a part of it. And I found it quite exciting. And then they mentioned this organization where artists meet and talk and share ideas and, commune more or less. So I was like, I'll be interested in it. And I came in and I found the library. Now, my background is not art. And I didn't train as an artist in school or anything. And so I found it quite fascinating because I wanted to understand this thing called art. And then came in here and found these books. So they became my introduction to this thing that I was always fascinated about.
So FCA has always revolved around the library space since its beginnings.
Yes, absolutely.
How would you actually describe your relationship with the wider community around FCA? Like, who's actually involved in it now, and how do those collaborations work, especially since its origins? You've done a lot of projects in the community and sort of taking art outside into public space, right? I think especially working in a psychiatric hospital, these kinds of collaborations, it seems that there's things very much not set within a gallery setting, especially since you're revolving mostly around a library and don't really have a permanent exhibition space or a collection or anything.
I mean, when I got involved, Professor Joe Nkrumah was still alive, one of the founding members of the FCA. Virginia Ryan, who was then in and out of Accra, was still around then. And Joe Nkrumah would come in every now and then, and we'll have long conversations about the future, about ideas, about where we wanted this thing to be. And right from its inception, it's always had this idea of being fluid, and so the physical space of the library wasn't going to be the only place it would operate from or have activities or projects in. So that meant that, and also because we're in Du Bois, and Du Bois had other space, we could always have that conversation with them about using their spaces. And then other places, there were other artists, other members who had spaces that they could give to the activities of the FCA. And so, for instance, with the project Art in the Garden, which was always a one-day pop-up event where artists would do performances, put up installations and other things, would be people offering their homes and people with big, open gardens or large spaces offering their homes, and we'll be hosting, exhibitions there. Now, when we got involved and actively involved and started making those decisions, we felt that we should open this up a bit more. And so we actually captured the true essence of art in public spaces, and so which then democratizes the audience or cultivates a lot more audience. So we started going into communities like Jamestown, went into Koforidua, we worked in Takrady and other spaces, and actually opening up the space and possibility for new audience to engage with contemporary art as well.
And how do you actually make sure that those kinds of things are ongoing? I mean, once you do an initial exhibition or project, is that something you find people respond well to in the community?
Of course, I mean, people respond to it in many ways. It's also not having pen and taking, say, okay, these are the number of people who came. That is not the goal. But then you find out also the relationships you build in the communities long term. So there are people that we met in 2009 that we're still in conversations with, who we're still part of our projects or who still come around. And then for me, those are some of the things, the indicators and markers that you look out for.
So last time I was in Accra, I was struck by a certain incident, actually, when I was sitting in the library here with Ajwa, and somebody came knocking on the door, and he was very stressed seeming. He seemed a little bit distressed and was really wanting to look for some advice. And he had just come here because he had trained in art and wasn't actually sort of progressing in his career. And I'm looking at Ajwa in the corner right now because she went out and sat down for an hour outside and had a conversation with him, really understanding his problems, understanding his needs. And I was really struck by that because it seems like people in the artistic community here really know FCA as a space to go to and know that you are people who are sort of, you know, able to speak on that level to them and advise or point in the right direction. So I'm wondering how you see your role as FCA as this kind of incubator or like oracle that people can come consult almost. And if that's sort of that's a common thing.
I mean, it used to be something that would happen where you find people walking with some kind of frustration or stress and want an outlet. And when it happens that way, the least you can do is to give people the space to express that. We don't claim we have all the solution, but in the conversation, you could realize that they themselves might be thinking of things, but just want that second voice that assures them that yes, you're on the right path. You could keep it. Try this. You can, and we avail ourselves to go on that journey with them. Also because there's a wider community of artists that we can say, okay, talk to these artists. They've been here before. They probably know certain things that could help you out of this, or you could go on this journey with them. And so that's how we operate. I think that we always say we like to operate as a catalyst, part of a chemical reaction, but not the one that is visibly present.
Yeah, so I mean, that was one kind of, you know, an informal thing of people coming here, but what about the more formal side of that and the actual education? I know you're all very involved and run the Crit Lab program, for example, every year in, I think it's next month, right? You have a whole group of artists coming together and sort of have a week-long session of sort of mentorship for their artistic practice. So would you see that as part of the same idea of being a catalyst as well?
Of course. I mean, the Crits actually began with BC Silva. When we met BC in 2011, when she had come to Accra on holiday in December, and one of our members invited her to give a presentation here about what she was doing in Lagos. And she was like, I've always been to Accra. I always say there's nothing happening here. So she was super impressed that on the 31st of December, people would come to listen to her about, you know, what she was doing, her presentation. And that began the journey. So she went back to Lagos the following year, or she went back and then she invited us to, it hadn't been given a name yet then, but she started a 2-week project with Global Crit Clinic, that's Kianga and Shane Debs, and then invited 4 of our members to be a part of it. And then she started talking with us about when she was going to do the longer residency, if we could get people to go. I went to that residency for 30 days in Lagos, and then she talked about making that residency mobile across the continent because she realized that it was something that was important to the continent.
Just and for context, this was after she had already set up the CCA Lagos, right?
Yes. And so then it became ASICO as he started moving around, and as he came to Ghana in 2013, and we realized that it was important in towards how do you build the intellectual infrastructure for artists within their practice, and how do you make that room for artists to continually think critically about their work and their practice.
Yeah, so I think what I understand of ASICO is it was also a very collaborative and non-hierarchical approach to art education, right? It was very much peer reviews with artists happening, which I think is very different to a lot of formal artistic education, especially on the continent with its own histories of education. Exactly. So what did you experience from that?
I mean, we technically took the model and kind of reshaped it because the times have also changed and adopted it. And after ASICO came in 2013, it came back in 2017 for just the curators.
So ASICO roams around the continent.
It roams around the continent. But in between ASICO and we had invited Global Crit Clinic team to always from 2012 to 2015 to do that 2-week intensive here, and we felt we saw its impact and we saw how important that was. So it's something when BC passed, unfortunately, and when we started thinking about what other things to do to continue her legacy and other things, it's we decided that it's something that we'll go on with it, and we were doing this in partnership with Black Star Lines and Exit Frame, and now Exit Frame kind of being the lead curators and the other institutions, being partners of it.
Okay, could you describe Exit Frame for us?
So Exit Frame is a collective of a 5-member collective of myself, Ato Annan, Ajwa Amwa, Bernard Akwe Jackson, Kwesi Ohineyaye, and Kelvin Hazel.
And how did you get together as a collective in the first place? Was it in relation to, did a lot of them study together in Kumasi, or?
No, Bernard and Ajwa studied together. Kelvin and Kwesi also studied in Kumasi, but Kwesi was a year ahead of Kelvin also. But we've always been friends outside of the school. We've done projects together. Remember that Du Bois in Our Time, it was actually birthed out when we came out of Du Bois in Our Time in 2012 or so, or 2013, where we realized that.
And Du Bois in Our Time was at a group exhibition, or was it just for I know I've seen the book over there in the corner actually.
It was a group exhibition where 5 artists, led by Nubuke Foundation, 5 artists, no more than that. But it's been a long time. But out of that, we decided to formalize it and begin to work together as a collective with a lot more intention than just being friends, working and sharing ideas.
And so together you run the Crit Lab. So describe your experience with Crit Lab, because I understand, does it also go to different areas in the country and you actually take the artistic program, I think? Did you have it up at Red Clay Studio last year with Ibrahim Mahama?
Yes.
How do you choose those locations, and how do you actually make the decision to bring this outside of Accra and around the rest of the country? Or is that sort of understanding the model that Bissy Silva was implementing with ASICO and also having it as this more roaming pedagogical program?
First of all, it gives people in other places access, that if you were to probably station it in one place could always be limiting or can be limited. And so we decided to experiment with it moving around locally, first of all, to begin with. Of course, it has its implication in terms of cost, because then you need to, if let's say it was happening in Accra, you are always assured of, let's say, this space that already belongs to one of your partners that you could use it for no cost or at no cost. But then once it moves around, it means renting spaces, looking for partners who could give something in return or who could contribute to it. And so I think we are still experimenting with that in terms of it moving around. We've been to Kumasi. The first one took place in Accra. We've been to Kumasi. We did. In Kumasi, we were on campus because Black Star Lines is there. So we use their space, and then we use the museum, which also partnered with us, the KNUST Museum, which partnered with us. And then in Tamale, Red Clay, SCCA were partners, so we use their space. In Takoradi, we are partnering with the Takoradi Technical University Art Department. That is also partnering with us. So I would say it has its challenges. At the moment, we are fundraising for it, because it's also free for people who participate in it. And so people should go and donate, towards it, because that's the only way we can keep it running. Yeah.
So could you explain a little bit more about the differences between what you do with the Quit Lab and more formal art education that takes place in Ghana? What do you think, how do you see artists as benefiting from that more collaborative approach in relation to maybe what they would have done in art school in a formal education?
You come out of school with a certificate, which Quit Lab doesn't give you. I think that the most important thing is the peer-to-peer exchanges, it's almost like a safe space to be vulnerable about your work, with a group of people you can grow together with professionally, which school environment might not offer you that. And so that's one of the differences I see. And also for people who already have a practice, more or less, and which school at that time still trying to figure out what you want to do and how you want to do it.
I want to go back and just understand a bit more about FCA and how you would actually frame yourself in the artistic community, because I know that obviously Accra at the moment and Ghana in general has a very kind of booming commercial art scene, right? There's a lot of artists that are becoming commercially successful abroad, mainly painters, for example, and it's very much within a particular world and a particular market-oriented environment. And I think to exist as a space like FCA, where a lot of things you do are much more community-based and much more collaborative and not necessarily to do with, art that is marketable or sellable, for example. I'm wondering how you'd position yourselves as a space in relation to that wider context of what's happening in the art scene in Ghana right now.
I think that they all need to exist. We all need to exist. It's for us, I think that is to have these multiple voices that articulate what contemporary art is. There's a room for the market, there's a room for the ideas and the things, that collaborations that we do, and they're all equally important. It's not to give one prominence over the other, but I think that for us, what is always important is that the artists have the room to explore ideas and experiment without the pressures of the market, without the pressures of I need to sell. But that is also not something that we are naive about, because it takes resources to do those experimentations. So can we be that buffer? Can we be that place where they can come to and think about ideas, think about other things, and be able to have the support to be able to implement those ideas? Yes.
So you do see a kind of a relationship as well. You're not entirely independent from that system, but there's a lot of overlap between.
As you've seen, it's a very small space, whether whether you look at it as Accra or as Ghana. The same artists revolve or go to these different spaces all the time, and so we will work with an artist, or there are artists who come here who end up eventually also having commercial shows and being very successful in the market. So we do what we do, others do what they do. We complement each other and keep going.
No, I mean, it's nice to see it as really part of a wider ecosystem in the city as well. Well, thanks for introducing us a little more to FCA. I think it's probably a good time to bring on Sinethemba now.
Yay!
So we've just been speaking to Ato from the Foundation for Contemporary Art Ghana, who's been talking about some of the origins of FCA and how they collaborate with a wider community of artists in Ghana and beyond. I'm now super excited to welcome our guest, Sinethemba Twalo, who is the co-director of the brilliantly named NGO Nothing Gets Organised in Johannesburg. And on behalf of NGO, Sinethemba has just curated the exhibition Delay, an Encounter and or Other Proximate Unknowns here at FCA, which opened on Thursday. So we're super happy to have you here. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Ato, could you maybe tell us why you invited NGO to be your collaborators on this exhibition and what it was that interested you in their work in the first place?
I mean, it's interesting. And we've known some members of of the collective, Gabi, who had been here in 2017, yes, for her research in the Sao Paulo.
Oh, yes. So then it was 2016.
2016. And then she came, I think, for the Berlin as well.
For the Berlin Biennale, yeah.
So sure. But we have common friends as well. And as you know, we had different, interest in looking at different people. But we felt that they were doing something very different from what we're doing. And they were not stuck with making exhibitions in the traditional sense of exhibition making. They were more interested in the encounters or the interactions, the moments, the events that take place, and so how do we use that as a way of activating or reactivating, our community or our space? And for us, that was quite exciting, and of course it's also vibe, like if you meet somebody you could vibe with or you could go along with, it happens, it's not forced, and so that's how it started.
Yeah, Sinethemba, I understand you also came on a research trip here a few months prior to the exhibition as well, right? So what was it that struck you the most about FCA and also their community? What was it that made you excited to do this exhibition from that trip?
I think there was really more so, I'll begin with the generous spirit and a meeting of minds, I think collaboration is always easier when you meet people and then you don't have to try too hard. It's quite easy and you understand each other. And that was what, through our process, even prior to actually coming to the research trip, because we had a number of meetings online, it was just, the engagement was not superficial. We could articulate if each of us had issues, and there was a certain solidarity that, that one could discern primarily based on the fact that we were understanding that we're working within obviously different geographical regions and scenes, but we have common aims essentially. It's to think about artistic practice within the continent of Africa, and establish a network where resources are shared and we're able to get things done in ways that we don't feel compromised as institutions. We're able to still realize our ambitions within our languages, and our languages are able to then impel another way of seeing and understanding of the work that art can do.
Mm-hmm. Could you then explain a bit about how that turned into the exhibition and how that helped formulate the concept for how you brought together a group of artists to come here as well?
So the research trip was very heavy. We were always on the move. And I think on the last few days, they took me to Ninoy's compound.
Yeah, this is Ninoy Norti, the artist, the musician.
And that really was my entry point into the exhibition. It was like being confronted by this other world, and there was a mishmash of different objects and images and all these instruments everywhere, and it was quite cluttered, right? But you could see there was this dedication and passion to how he thought about himself in relation to his space, but how he was making this world. So yesterday we went to Ninoy's studio or library, and what I encountered was significantly different to what one had seen a few months ago. And I'm interested in this process of his space constantly changing and shifting to meet his moods, his sentiment, whatever he's preoccupied with intellectually at the time, and how sound is always figuring, And, we had a conversation yesterday, and I was, one thing I remember from that conversation was how his space and his practice is really theory in action, It's taking the sentiment of free jazz and improvisation and applying it consistently in one's life, and you see that in that space. So that's where the exhibition began for me, and it was this encounter in particular. And then, it was thinking with other people's practices or people whose work has an affinity towards those gestures which I had encountered at first.
Yeah, I think particularly in the way you describe his space itself as being something that's malleable and constantly changing, I think also maybe informed some of how you wanted to curate the exhibition as well, and showing these different perspectives that are not necessarily fixed and set in time or place.
Yeah. The thing is also, for me, I'm not so interested in conventional exhibition making processes. I'm always interested in what before or after the exhibition, what type of situation does it create. So as NGO, generally as an institution, we don't mount exhibitions that run for a long period, and if we do, it's generally within the context of inhabiting another environment which is completely different to us. So we work taking the site into focus, which the site being Johannesburg. And because Joburg, firstly, there's a certain lack of patience, I would say, or just from my own analysis from publics, and it also constantly changing, how Johannesburg is constantly reimagining itself. So as an institution, we're also responding to that way of working, understanding that things can't be static and things need to constantly shift. And so when we're thinking with art, we also make that proposition. Obviously, going back and beginning, really, this white elephant, which obviously was the second Johannesburg Biennale, which is also a failed institution, and then also contending with failure within the present, within our time now, and looking at institutions such as JAG, Museum Africa, and how their conditions a lot of the time are compromised by the city council, and them working despite these conditions. So it's always, firstly prioritizing a certain urgency, understanding that we only realize projects when we feel it's urgent as the practitioners within NGO, not to over-program ourselves or feel instrumentalized, but also at the same time to respond to a certain failure of museology to address our concerns.
Would you say then the practice of NGO comes from a bit of a place of institutional critique as well?
Yes, it's figured. So when we began, it was really more so related around the question of funding. And just as the various members, our interactions with, cultural institutions that disperse funding. And we'd wanted to articulate a different relationship where we as the people also who are receiving this funding are able to have more say, rather than us always being instrumentalized to kind of fit an agenda, but also respond to someone else's agenda. How do we then go about, if we're able to also say, okay, you're giving us money, but we, as producers are also giving you something as valuable as what you're giving us, and those relations need to change. It can't be a hierarchical relationship where you tell us what to do and there's a certain structure. We need to negotiate that relation for ourselves as partners and find a way that works best for us and for all of us, and we don't feel compromised also.
Do you still occasionally work with larger institutions as well? Is that something that you're actually open to, or do you kind of have certain hard lines that you're not able to cross in your programming?
We are already, I'm not of the inclination to say, oh, we're outside, right? There is no outside. Well, there is. Because I'm also thinking about this concept of the black outside. But within that certain outside, you're already implicated. We're really working in a reality where we are so instrumentalized as bodies and institutions and beings, and it's just negotiating that. It's working through the chaos, knowing that the chaos is always there and working despite. So I don't say that I'm moving away from working with certain institutions, but I'd rather be interested in how I, change those relations to fit what I'm intending to do.
So there's a certain fluidity in the way you're actually collaborating.
Yes.
Let's go back then. Maybe could you expand a bit upon what you mean by the black outside?
So encountering, I'm interested in the question of ecologies and geographies and geology and, you know, various changes within the ground. The question of land is a very important thing within the context of South Africa. You know, people have been dispossessed of their land and they still haven't been able to get it back. So, you know, part of Black study within that particular region is beleaguered by this incessant call for the return of land and how we go about undertaking these processes. But also, I would say that this question really was impelled by a conversation I saw online between Sadia Hartman and Fred Moten, which was initiated by J. Cameron Carter and Sarah Jane Cervenek, which was thinking around this idea of the Black outdoors and being of the outdoors, but it also as a position that one can take. So I'm currently writing the last chapters of my PhD, which is thinking around this question of the Black outdoors, but relating it to the question of ecology, but also artist practice, contemporary art practice, and thinking particularly within the realm of the curatorial. So I teach a course also which is thinking around questions of the curatorial within, you know, these registers of the Black outdoors. But it's more so thinking about the various entanglements of nature, violence, coloniality, artists who think around these practices, these processes, but more so also forms of institutionality that prioritize a certain disidentification with how the world is, or forms of world making right now that one sees happening within contemporaneity.
Yeah, I'm interested in how you also relate these ideas to a much more site-specific context, right? I think here the exhibition you've curated is very intentionally on the site of the W.E.B. Du Bois Museum. You know, we're sitting right here where he lived and died, just next door. And I'm wondering how, especially in your first research, if that actually kind of shaped or brought light to some of your existing ideas.
Well, that was the very first space I visited. I remember it was the first day and Ato and Adwa were on their way and I was like, oh no, I'll walk because now I found that you guys are right by my hotel. And I went into the museum and I was like, oh, I was really emotional because Du Bois is such a figure within Black study. Like, we always refer back to his work as the first point in thinking around ideas of double consciousness, thinking about Black subjectivity, thinking questions of subjectification, and I realized at the time that the space needed. I needed to intervene somehow. Like, I wouldn't be settled, not, beginning some sort of conversation, because also, these histories are so implicated within what I do, and then confronting, the memorial where his body's resting, and just also how the practice of care within the people who are in the museum, how there's, this certain care over Du Bois and his legacy. And then, FCA, its location was similarly close. So I wasn't interested. I went to many locations, which were possibilities, but I wasn't interested in activating these questions somewhere else because I thought, the site specificity of FCA and the museum, its proximity to the museum, could, allow us to build a world of our own. And I had to prioritize the work that FCA. It always had to be, somewhere close to FCA. Yeah. The work they're doing is super important, and I couldn't imagine myself utilizing another space. It could have been imagined larger, taking into consideration scale and the possibility of realizing more ambitious projects, but the important work that they're doing in terms of administering resources to the community of Accra was is a sentiment that NGO also, prioritizes and was the reason for our founding as an institution. So their way of working really was so close, and I had to implicate the space. The space had to be there.
Yeah, I'm also quite interested in how this, you wanted to work with FCA, but FCA does not really have a permanent exhibition space, right? I think something that struck me when I arrived a week ago was that since last time I was here, Ato, you had built an entirely new wing of the building just for this exhibition. And really, there was a whole room that wasn't there before, which eventually over the course of the week almost became this white cube exhibition space in your courtyard that just kind of manifested out of nothing. So I'm really curious in the way that you're able to use the resources of the exhibition as well, and use the kind of the programming that's going into it to also benefit yourselves as an institution in the long run. I'm sure that it's not like you're going to demolish that exhibition space after this exhibition's done, right?
I think, it's, for us, it was also a question of finance and resources, because having an exhibition space, maintaining it, you had that extra burden of even staff to run the space. And so from the very beginning, we had always seen the city as a bigger exhibition space where you could almost insert yourself into it, any space, and make it, what it's supposed to be. And with coming to this exhibition or this project, it meant that you needed to make certain things available. And since Sinethemba wanted to use this prime site, or the site as a prime space of engagement, we had to construct things to fit that purpose. But then it also was in such a way that it lacked a certain permanence. It could be taken down anytime we wanted to. So we're not constrained or bounded by those physical structures. And it was also working in tandem with the spirit that he himself carries, or the NGO carries, so that it's fluid, it's mobile, it's not constrained by the standard institutional demands of what a space has to be or what an institution has to be, basically.
No, I think there's definitely like a challenge of any site that you're working in, but I think the idea of seeing it as something a bit more fluid is quite interesting, right? That thing may be here one day, it may not be there tomorrow, but I'm sure you'll be able to find some kind of reuse. I think I'm interested in how also maybe something temporary like an exhibition can have some kind of longevity to it as well, and maybe be part of like the wider time scale of what you do with FCA.
The structure itself could also change. Things could be added onto it. We're thinking about different things, but it's really always transitional. Like it could be something else, someday or tomorrow or when the exhibition is over, But Sinethemba, I want to ask you about the artists. You've talked generally about the ideas, but specifically the ideas that moved, about those artists that moved you to, or practitioners that moved you to include them in this work.
So it was really thinking about artists who prioritize a certain language or sensibility, and interest in, I guess, the architectonic implications of I would say collapse, thinking, okay, what does a space become after collapse, right? So I wasn't really interested in just, putting pictures on the wall or inviting primarily people who worked as visual artists. So one thing one notices also is that, for instance, Ola works as both an architect and an artist. Room 19 don't see themselves as artists. They are architects, and they make spatial interventions which think around, questions related. Well, right now they practices configuring around the NE51 house structure, which is an imposition which was undertaken by the apartheid government on Black life. But it's also thinking about, despite those violences, how are people imagining themselves in a way that the violence then doesn't occlude or foreclose you imagining possibility in your life. So, they proposed the idea of the lounge as a verb, lounging, as opposed to lounge as a noun, right? Where black life is imagined, and selfhood is constantly shifting and contingent on how one imagines themselves within their intimate structures. Jabu Arnel, I had worked previously with, particularly for the Berlin Biennale, and he's a member. He's a proxy member of NGO. They're people. So NGO initially was started by Gabi, Denewa, and I, but there've been people who, since the beginning of this journey, who've kind of followed us, and Jabu's one of them. He initially designed our logo as an institution, and I think this was 2015 or 2016. Donna Kukama is another person who we work with extensively, and who's a member of NGO also. Natalie Penang, I'm interested in her practice because she creates these avatars and creates her own worlds. And I'm always imagining blackness otherwise, right? I'm always imagining future blackness. And she is an artist who prioritizes that sentiment and prioritizes the ability for us to imagine blackness always shifting to demand. Not someone else's demand, but our demands, right? And also, she's future-oriented. And then Ninoy is... we haven't caught up with Ninoy.
I don't think we ever will.
No one has caught up with Ninoy. People will be looking at Ninoy's practice 50 years from now and saying, oh my God. Yeah. I'd initially also invited the Library of Things We Forgot to Remember because my practice also begins with sound from the sonic. I work as a sonic practitioner also. That's where my artist practice is configured around those questions. So when I begin an idea, it's always from a sound, and Ninoy became the entry point in this particular situation. But I'd also invited the Library of Things We Forgot to Remember to also work with us, which is an audiovisual archive based in Johannesburg, which was started by Kudzanai Shiruai, an artist who is currently based in Harare, but at some point was living in Johannesburg also. And a lot of the work that the library does is thinking about archives of black liberation, but not only focused on that, but also thinking around old moments of joy within black life. Sorry, I didn't include Luana Vitra, who also works with this question of value and thinking around extractive regimes. So when we had thought about, also in conversation with the other member of NGO, Gabi, when we'd had conversations about this invitation, we were interested in the built environment of Accra, and responding to that in particular, responding to a certain I guess architectonic reality that we then had to deploy as a methodology.
Yeah, I think something that was also quite interesting in Jabu's work was this lack of being precious about his own work and a collaboration he entered based on the site. Everything was very site-specific. He sourced materials around and in the end invited another local artist to intervene into his, sculptural work, which I thought was really beautiful because he'd just seen their shop by the roadside, right? And was very inspired by it and invited them to actually come and intervene in his own artwork. So that's very much a direct connection to the city and the space around the exhibition site.
Everyone before kept on asking, what is Jabu going to do? And I'm like, just leave him. He needs to arrive in Accra. He'll make a plan. He'll understand what he needs to do. He works like that. So generally when we have discussions, he's just like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm not too sure. Maybe I won't be able to create a work for you, but I might. And I'm like, it's okay. Just, have fun. Don't take it too seriously. And, think with what you do. Always, your language should be prominent. Don't try to adapt your language to fit into something, but rather think about how like you can stretch your language, right, to enter into conversation, rather than feeling like you have to, you're constrained by an agenda. Again, going back to this thing.
Yeah, but also I think that sense of trust is very important in any collaboration, right? You know that you bring him here and on the site he will work something out. I think something I'm interested to understand is going off on that idea of collaboration. You have worked with two institutions in a way. Could you describe a little bit about the overlapping practices of actually inviting one space to exhibit in your space, right? Or one collective to exhibit in your space, and sort of also giving over some agency and trust in that process?
I mean, for us, the first thing was not to interfere, more or less, or dictate the pace at which the other institution, needs to work. And also, I think not being apprehensive about if this is going to be done or not, For me, even if NGO had come here and said, on the opening, let's sit down and have a conversation, let's invite people and just have it would have been fine. Because I think that it's also atypical of the contemporary art world, rush, put people under pressure, and it was a grind culture, more or less, exhaust people. And sometimes rest itself could be very important, or organic, like Jabu's process of coming here, walking around the space and allowing the space to inform what he has to do is very essential. And so we're not going to dictate, we're not going to interfere. We were open to learn from them, and that meant allowing them to make decisions and not decisions and just saying, okay, look, how do we enable this to happen? How do we assist you to make this happen? And it's making available also what the conditions on the grounds are, and then we find solutions to what would work or what cannot work together, eventually. But it's really giving them a free hand. For me, that's the spirit of collaboration. It's because if you go in knowing already what you want and how you want it, they might as well not invite people to collaborate with you. And most of the time that seems to be what people we make jokes about, like people come to, what do you think of this? Meanwhile, they already know the answer they want, or they are kind of preparing you for an answer that will be suitable for them. But then if you look at that, you sometimes should allow yourself to be shocked by or surprised by things. And for me, that is the spirit of collaborations. When you give people, yourself, not just people, yourself, the opportunity to learn from others through what they bring in.
In a dream scenario then, is there, following on from this collaboration, is there any space or project or practitioner anywhere in the world that you would like to collaborate with in the future? Living or dead even, purely speculative. I'm going to ask you the same question, Sinethemba, afterwards.
So many. But I would have loved to sit at the staircase of the Du Bois's house and watch him walking day in and day out. Would have been a fly in the corner of his library and get an insight into what he was thinking about.
Well, Du Bois for one, but also Sun Ra. Sun Ra figures heavily in Nino's studio, and I think I was at first glance, at first meeting, that was also something, because I'm completely obsessed with Sun Ra.
How come?
Free jazz. He was creating worlds, and we still, trying to make sense of it all. And that's the beauty of it. It's like, being able to shift and also utilize opacity. Things don't always have to be known. It's like always marching towards the unknown and letting it lead you. So part of like my curatorial practice really is is trying to figure out what this poetics of the unknown could possibly be, this imminent unknown. And that's the sentiment that always kind of overrides everything else. It's not to be anxious about the unknown. And also understanding blackness as an unknown, and writers like Du Bois allowing that to infiltrate through their work, and many others. We can think of Edward Glissant, we can think of Denise Ferreira da Silva, we can think of practitioners who are making work that speculates on the unknown. Octavia Butler.
No, I think that's a really beautiful sentiment to end on then, and really also understanding this, the exhibition as free jazz or something, and this maybe malleability of the, the world building potential of it even. And I think that's also encapsulated in what's happened here.
And jazz obviously being that, the locus where black people could say we are theory in motion. Well, black people have always been theory. We've always been technology. We were the first technology when they took us, to these so-called new worlds, and when they make us labor incessantly, but we are always technology and we're always theory, and it's comprehending our place in the world, and not shying away also from the violence of certain questions, but rather negotiating their tenets and coming out stronger.
Well, thanks so much for that. And thank you, Ato, for having us, and Adjoa in the corner over there for having us here at the Foundation for Contemporary Art Ghana. The exhibition's running until the 14th of January, and if anyone's able to check it out, maybe Accra's far away for some people listening, but okay, thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. You can listen to and read more of our original editorial content online at OtherNetwork.io. OtherNetwork is a project initiated by Cookies together with IFA, Institut für Auslandsbeziehungen. This series is generously supported by Between Bridges Foundation. It is produced and hosted by Federico Martelli and Colin Keys, with sound design, editing, and production by Jack Bardwell. Original music is by Jack Bardwell. OtherNetwork's research team includes Abraham Tete in Accra, Samantha Mudisinjana in Johannesburg, Camilo Quiroga in Bogotá, Camila Alegría in Santiago de Chile, and Mateus dos Reis in Sao Paulo.